And you immediately thought of me? Still calm. No, he mentioned your family. He was silent, staring at the road. I was worried suddenly, worried about protecting Jacob. He just thought it was a silly superstition, I said quickly. He didn't expect me to think anything of it. It didn't seem like enough, I had to confess. It was my fault. I forced him to tell me. Why? Lauren said something about you. She was trying to provoke me, and an older boy from the tribe said your family didn't come to the reservation. Only it sounded like he meant something different. So I got Jacob alone and I tricked it out of him, I admitted, hanging my head. Tricked him how? He asked. I tried to flirt. It worked better than I thought it would. Disbelief colored my tone as I remembered. I'd like to have seen that, he chuckled darkly. And you accuse me of dazzling people. Poor Jacob Black. I blushed and looked out my window into the night. What did you do then? He asked after a minute. I did some research on the internet. And did that convince you? His voice sounded barely interested, but his hands were clamped hard onto the steering wheel. No, nothing fit. Most of it was kind of silly, and then I stopped. What? I decided it didn't matter, I whispered. It didn't matter? His tone made me look up. I had finally broken through his carefully composed mask. His face was incredulous, with just a hint of the anger I'd feared. No, I said softly, it doesn't matter to me what you are. A hard, mocking edge entered his voice. You don't care if I'm a monster? If I'm not human? No. He was silent, staring straight ahead again. His face was bleak and cold. You're angry, I sighed. I shouldn't have said anything. No, he said, but his tone was as hard as his face. I'd rather know what you're thinking, even if what you're thinking is insane. So I'm wrong again, I challenged. That's not what I was referring to. It doesn't matter, he quoted, gritting his teeth together. I'm right? I gasped. Does it matter? I took a deep breath. Not really, I paused. But I am curious. My voice, at least, was composed. He was suddenly resigned. What are you curious about? How old are you? 17, he answered promptly. And how long have you been 17? His lips twitched as he stared at the road. A while, he admitted at last. Okay, I smiled, pleased that he was still being honest with me. He stared down at me with watchful eyes, much as he had before, when he was worried. I would go into shock. When he was worried, I would go into shock. I smiled wider in encouragement, and he frowned. Don't laugh. But how can you come out during the daytime? He laughed anyway. Myth. Burned by the sun? Myth. Sleeping in coffins? Myth. He hesitated for a moment, and a peculiar tone entered his voice. I can't sleep. It took me a minute to absorb that. At all? Never, he said, his voice nearly inaudible. He turned to look at me with a wistful expression. The golden eyes held mine, and I lost my train of thought. I stared at him until he looked away. You haven't asked me the most important question yet. His voice was hard now. When he looked at me again, his eyes were cold. I blinked, still dazed. Which one is that? You aren't concerned about my diet? He asked sarcastically. Oh, I murmured. That. Yes, that. His voice was bleak. Don't you want to know if I drink blood? I flinched. Well, Jacob said something about that. What did Jacob say? He said flatly. He said you didn't hunt people. He said your family wasn't supposed to be dangerous because you only hunted animals. He said we weren't dangerous? His voice was deeply skeptical. Not exactly. He said you weren't supposed to be dangerous, but the Quileutes still didn't want you on their land, just in case. He looked forward, but I couldn't tell if he was watching the road or not. So was he right about not hunting people? I tried to keep my voice as even as possible. The Quileutes have a long memory, he whispered. I took it as a confirmation. Don't let that make you complacent, though, he warned me. They're right to keep their distance from us. We are still dangerous. I don't understand. We try, he explained slowly. We're usually very good at what we do. Sometimes we make mistakes. Me, for example, allowing myself to be alone with you. This is a mistake? I heard the sadness in my voice, but I didn't know if he could as well. A very dangerous one, he murmured. We were both silent then. I watched the headlights twist with the curves of the road. They moved too fast. It didn't look real. It looked like a video game. I was aware of the time slipping away so quickly, like the black road beneath us, and I was hideously afraid that I would never have another chance to be with him like this again, openly, the walls between us gone for once. His words hinted at an end, and I recoiled from the idea. I couldn't waste 1 minute I had with him. Tell me more, I asked desperately, not caring what he said, just so I could hear his voice again. He looked at me quickly, startled by the change in my tone. What more do you want to know? Tell me why you hunt animals instead of people, I suggested. My voice still tinged with desperation. I realized my eyes were wet, and I fought against the grief that was trying to overpower me. I don't want to be a monster. His voice was very low. But animals aren't enough? He paused. I can't be sure, of course, but I'd compare it to living on tofu and soy milk. We call ourselves vegetarians, our little inside joke. It doesn't completely satiate the hunger, or rather thirst, but it keeps us strong enough to resist, most of the time. His tone turned ominous. Sometimes it's more difficult than others. Is it very difficult for you now? I asked. He sighed. Yes. But you're not hungry now, I said confidently, stating, not asking. Why do you think that? Your eyes. I told you I had a theory. I've noticed that people, men in particular, are crabbier when they're hungry. He chuckled. You are observant, aren't you? I didn't answer. I just listened to the sound of his laugh, committing it to memory. Were you hunting this weekend with Emmett? I asked, when it was quiet again. Yes. He paused for a second, as if deciding whether or not to say something. I didn't want to leave, but it was necessary. It's a bit easier to be around you when I'm not thirsty. Why didn't you want to leave? It makes me anxious to be away from you. His eyes were gentle but intense, and they seemed to be making my bones turn soft. I wasn't joking when I asked you to try not to fall in the ocean or get run over last Thursday. I was distracted all weekend worrying about you, and after what happened tonight, I'm surprised that you did make it through a whole weekend unscathed. He shook his head and then seemed to remember something. Well, not totally unscathed. What? Your hands, he reminded me. I looked down at my palms, at the almost healed scrapes across the heels of my hands. His eyes missed nothing. I fell, I sighed. That's what I thought. His lips curved at the corners. I suppose, being you, it could have been much worse, and that possibility tormented me the entire time I was away. It was a very long 3 days. I really got on Emmett's nerves. He smiled ruefully at me. 3 days? Didn't you just get back today? No. We got back Sunday. Then why weren't any of you in school? I was frustrated, almost angry, as I thought of how much disappointment I had suffered because of his absence. Well, you asked if the sun hurt me, and it doesn't. But I can't go out in the sunlight, at least not where anyone can see. Why? I'll show you sometime, he promised. I thought about it for a moment. You might have called me, I decided. He was puzzled. But I knew you were safe. But I didn't know where you were. I hesitated, dropping my eyes. What? His velvety voice was compelling. I didn't like it, not seeing you. It makes me anxious, too. I blushed to be saying this out loud. He was quiet. I glanced up apprehensive and saw that his expression was pained. Ah, he groaned quietly. This is wrong. I couldn't understand his response. What did I say? Don't you see, Bella? It's one thing for me to make myself miserable, but a wholly other thing for you to be so involved. He turned his anguished eyes to the road, his words flowing almost too fast for me to understand. I don't want to hear that you feel that way. His voice was low but urgent. His words cut me. It's wrong. It's not safe. I'm dangerous, Bella. Please grasp that.